So basically what you're suggesting is, you say that there's less growth for the amount of money being spent. So are you seeing like a period where we might see some stagflation potentially, where we have inflation with not as much growth really?
I think it's a possibility. I don't need to be right necessarily on that, but I think there's a very large possibility that some periods of stagflation in the next decade would be a big part of it. And then, but certainly, inflation is cyclical as well. Like in the 70s, we've had 3 waves of inflation during the entire decade, even starting a little before the 70s in the mid 60s. And those 3 waves, the big part of it was they got progressively higher. So we saw higher highs in CPI, for instance, just a way of gauging that. And today, I think we're going to see something similar. I don't know if cyclically we're at peak right now of inflation. And I don't think I need to necessarily answer that question. But I think that it's the more and the longer inflation stays in the system, it will infiltrate the economy in different ways and change psychologically the way the consumer behaves. And I think policymakers are far away from realizing those changes. And by that, I mean, back in the 70s, if you read any literature at the time and any financial history of the time, it was very well known, the perception of how fiscal stimulus would drive inflation. And today it's quite the opposite. I don't think we have that today. That notion is not there. So that is why we're seeing the current deficit, or the twin deficits that we have, including current account and also the trade balance, are both as low relative to GDP, or I should say as high relative to GDP of a deficit as it was at the worst times of the global financial crisis. And I don't think we have seen much of it yet, because defense spending is at a historical low that might rise with deglobalization trends and so forth. And so, we start thinking about those different ways of adding to the fiscal problem, and that I think will continue to drive inflation much further. So a lot of ramifications from this, but it's those are all big long-term issues that might set up different I would say a different macro and market environment with different leaderships and different factors that will work. I'm very concerned about earnings. I'm very concerned about like I would say a factor that has worked very well in the markets recently has been valuations. Companies that have extreme valuations got creamed. So if you look at most of the companies that have very high enterprise value relative to sales, or any company that doesn't provide a lot of profitability today, those companies relative to how much they're valuing in the markets, they really got re-rated in prices. And so some of those companies are down 40-50% today. The next wave of this is going to be, in my opinion, the companies that are been driven by their profitability and very stable earnings, which I think are unsustainable in an environment where you have wages and salaries growing, material prices rising, cost of capital rising. And so that's going to squeeze margins. So I'm paying attention to businesses that may fall into that category and be impacted by that.